Just in case you've never joined us before, Motivation Monday is an event hosted by the Graduate Student Committee of AERA's Motivation and Education Special Interest Group. We offer this programming as a way to disseminate and share ideas and strategies for conducting educational research. This year, Motivation Monday is a little different than our previous years. Our wonderful graduate student leaders, Maggie and Preeti and Corey and Yen, have developed these 5 panel discussions that are happening each month. Last month, we had an awesome discussion about social media and online branding, personal branding. It was a fantastic conversation. And so hopefully this month, we will get as much out of this month as we did last month. This month's topic is on reading and organizing research. And so I'm going to be facilitating the discussion for you today. But before we get started, we wanted to acknowledge that today is the United Nations International Day of the Girl, in which the international community recognizes female achievement and representation across all domains. The GSC recognizes, appreciates, and applauds all of the females and female identifying individuals who have contributed and continue to contribute to international educational research. And also today is National Indigenous Peoples Day. We want to acknowledge those individuals as well, and everyone who's contributed to educational research, both broadly and nationally and internationally. So we are proud to have female representation on our panel today, as long as we hopefully can get Dr. Anderman into the meeting. So this was sort of a last minute hiccup. Her link is not working for her, so we're going to try to get her in. But I would like to move to introduction of our panelists on today's panel on reading research, staying current, organized, and productive. So our first panelist, hopefully we can get her into the meeting soon, is Dr. Lindley Anderman. I know her personally. She's a wonderful scholar at The Ohio State University, a professor of educational psychology. She explores classroom contexts, both from the point of view of instructional delivery and interpersonal relationships among students and teachers, which support and maintain students' motivation and engagement in academic work. Dr. Anderman is a fellow of APA Division 15 and co-author of 2 textbooks, Classroom Motivation, Linking Research to Teacher Practice, published by Rutledge, and Educational Psychology, Developing Learners, published by Pearson. You can check out her textbooks at the links that we're going to be providing in the chat. I can provide those later on. I think, Preeti, if you have those links, you can drop them into the chat for everyone. Our second panelist is Dr. Logan Fiorella, who is an associate professor of educational psychology at the University of Georgia. Dr. Fiorella explores the cognitive science of student learning and its implications for instruction and the design of multimedia learning environments. He is the winner of the 2020 UGA Owens Institute for Behavioral Research Rising Star Award, the 2020 winner of the APA Division 15 Richard E. Snow Award for early contributions in educational psychology, and a 2020 National Academy of Education and Spencer Foundation postdoctoral fellow, among many other prestigious awards. We're very happy to have Dr. Fiorella with us, as well as Dr. Anderman, and hopefully we can get Dr. Anderman into the meeting. Thank you, Preeti, for dropping those links into the chat. Those are Dr. Anderman's co-authored textbooks.
As I mentioned to you last week, Andrew, I think you have to really think about, what does it mean? Like, what's your field of interest, right? And to me, the strategies and the approach is different depending on the purpose. And I know you're going to get into this with some of your later questions probably, but what it means to stay up to date in terms of writing a syllabus for a graduate seminar is different from what it means for your own writing, for example, or just for general awareness of stuff that's going on in the field, but it's maybe not directly relevant to your own work. So yeah, things like email alerts are helpful if you have a pretty narrowly defined area that you want to stay on top of, but it's not, I don't think, going to be very efficient if you're looking broadly or if you're working in multiple different literatures at the same time. So it kind of depends to me on what's my purpose in reading, how I go about it.
That's an excellent point. Can you follow up on that? So what kind of purposes would you have in mind, and how would that affect your reading strategies?
Okay. So early on in my career, I did a lot of research on social goals, and I did a lot of middle school transition studies. And so my focus was fairly specific, and I could keep on top of those literatures pretty well. But over time, various opportunities and interests have taken me into much broader fields. And so I can't imagine like using tables of contents to keep track of all the different fields that I've been writing in recently. So for example, you had a question about, how is it different to read for teaching versus for your own writing? And I would also add in there advising graduate students. So for one example would be a few years ago when Alyssa Emery was proposing her dissertation, she wanted to use this new approach to qualitative analysis that she had read about. I'd never heard of it. It had been used only in health psychology up to that point, and it wasn't in any journal that I would normally look at. And so I had to familiarize myself with that in order to serve as her advisor. I didn't have to become an expert in it. So it was a different, I read a bunch of stuff I wouldn't normally read just to sort of understand it, but I didn't have to read at the same depth that I would if I was writing a literature review, for example, or a handbook chapter, where I really would have to be really in deep into the specifics. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it certainly does. Absolutely. Dr. Fiorella, I would direct the same question to you. What about for you, for your various purposes? Do you share similar thoughts? Do you have different opinions? What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it really does matter what your purpose is, whether you're writing, whether you're reading for a particular writing project in mind, like a journal article or a book chapter or a grant proposal, or whether you're preparing for to teach a course, a seminar, or like Dr. Anderman said about advising graduate students. So yeah, definitely what your specific purpose is really going to dictate how you read the article, how you take notes on the article, what you're going to do with it. So I pretty much am always reading with some specific purpose in mind. I'm not doing a whole lot of reading where I'm just reading articles in isolation just because. I'm almost always thinking about the specific project that I'm planning. So I don't really separate, usually I don't really separate reading time that much from writing time, because just reading is just the first stages of writing. And so when you know what you're planning to write, it just totally shapes how you approach any article that you're reading. So just how in depth you go, what sections of the articles you're focusing on, what you're likely to be later writing about that article that you're reading. So, and I often will take notes on an article in a way that will kind of mimic how I might write about that same article. Like, in a study by so-and-so, they did this X, Y, and Z, they found, this is what the result, this is what it suggests, kind of mimicking how that might actually appear in a manuscript. So that's just, yeah. So definitely purpose is everything. And it's actually kind of hard to read without a pretty specific goal in mind or a project in mind, at least it is for me.
I completely agree with not separating reading and writing time. When I saw your question, Andrew, about how much time do you dedicate to reading, I was like, well, I don't really assign reading time in my schedule. I have writing time, and reading is part of that process. And if I'm using an article in something I'm writing, I almost certainly don't just read it once either, because you keep going back. And so I really like that idea of sort of taking note, thinking about how you're going to use it. But for things that I'm writing about, I'm going to spend a lot of time, for example, in the method section. I pay a lot of attention to how things are measured, right? And I look really carefully at who the sample was and stuff like that. And I may have to go back multiple times to sort of remind like recently I just wrote a handbook chapter for the new Handbook of Ed Psych with Deb Meyer. And I was sort of trying to work out this argument about methodologies that had been used in the teacher-student relationship literature. And I had to group studies based on these ones used this measure, these ones used observation, these ones used interview. And so the method becomes really critical, more so than the introduction and the discussion, actually. I'm more interested in my own judgment of whether I think that's a valid measure and what I think of their findings than I am what the authors might say in the discussion about it.
So I'm hearing, so for the both of you then, that reading and writing, they're sort of enveloped together, that this is really, that the allocating time and resources to doing so is interwoven. Would that be correct?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's based on what your purpose is. So then related to that, and so Dr. Anderman just referred to, talking about methods and measures and perhaps organizing by that. What are some strategies you have for organizing the abundance of literature, right? Because the days have gone by where we don't have to print everything out and have piles of papers everywhere, but there's a myriad of methods of doing so. So I'll go to Dr. Fiorella first and then to Dr. Anderman. What are some of your approaches for organizing the vast abundance of literature that is out there?
Yeah, so I guess the first step after I, save an article somewhere, I use, well, first of all, I use Mendeley mostly for just the general library of all the PDFs that I have. And I typically will, organize them by, tagging keywords and put them into folders. So I use kind of a basic organization there. But for me, because reading and writing are so connected, my main way of organizing is to take notes across several articles that I'm using for a literature review or something, and have all my notes on those articles in the same place, like in a Word document by itself. Like I take notes on individual articles, but I like to have all of my notes on the same topics and related articles in the same document, so I can move things around, and it's a lot easier to identify themes. And because basically what you're trying to do when you write an introduction is just figure out what the structure is of your argument. And it's a lot easier to do when you have all your notes in one place and you can move things around. And that's another reason why I like to write, my notes sometimes as it might somewhat appear in a manuscript, because then you can kind of, you have little blurbs for each article, and it's pretty easy to start grouping them by themes of some, depending on what you're writing about, obviously, whether it be certain, these studies found X and these studies found Y, or these studies use this method and these studies use the other method. It's a lot easier for me to organize when they're all in this, it's on the same document, rather than having a bunch of, PDFs to scroll through and open up separately. So that's the ultimate goal, is to transfer, individual articles to this notes file, at least for me. I mean, I'm obviously going to have to go back a lot to the original article, but that's usually my goal, is to try to distill it into, one place, so that then I can use that document to guide my writing.
Dr. Anderman?
Actually, surprisingly similar. So I did start out in the era where we had paper copies of everything, and in fact, we photocopied them out of the actual hard copy of the journal when I was first starting. And I recently threw away a lot of file folders full of paper copies of articles, because we have everything in PDF now. I personally do not use Mendeley, although I've had a lot of grad students who really like it. I did try EndNote when it sort of in an earlier iteration, but it felt very labor intensive to me, entering all the information in. It's probably more user friendly now, but it wasn't particularly good in its earlier editions. I'm lucky in that we have a lot of cloud storage available to us. And so I do save PDFs. And I basically create a folder for each project. And then I have folders within folders, if that makes sense. And I'll have all the PDFs in a folder. And I too actually take notes in Word. I've worked with people who use different approaches. I mentioned this chapter with Deb Meyer for the handbook. She really liked putting everything in an Excel spreadsheet. And she had columns set up with the citation and keywords, and she put in like quotes that she might want to use. And she asked me to sort of try mirroring that for my material. And I did it, but I didn't love it. I really like Word files. I like to, as Logan said, be able to move stuff around, and you start a section on one issue and a section on another issue. And then when you read the next article, you can kind of go, oh, this fits here and this fits here. You do need to be careful to make sure you get the citations in, because you can forget where you took things from. But I actually find that easier to transfer from that into the written document, the actual manuscript, than having it in these different formats. So I'm sure my method's not terribly efficient. I'm sure I have the same PDF saved in different folders in different places, but like I said, we have enough storage space that I can afford to do that. So that's how I do it.
Yeah, I would just add something actually. Yeah, because I do that as well. Like I use Mendeley. I used to like obsess over my organization scheme, and I just gave up on that because I never found like any of the platforms to actually do. It just didn't work for me. So now I use Mendeley technically, but it's just like, it really is just a storage of all my PDFs in one spot. And then I do what you were mentioning, where I have folders for projects, specific projects, and then I'll still have PDFs like specific to that project saved there. So yeah, I have like PDFs of the same article saved like a million times. Yeah. But the only thing that I think actually worked for me is taking it from the article itself to my own notes, and have a coherent, just a single document. That's been the only thing that's really worked, and easy for me to do, at least.
Since it's so germane to what we're talking about right now, we do have a question from the audience. I'll take it now. Do either of you find that EndNote has any value? Have you ever worked with EndNote?
Well, I haven't personally. I'm sure it does have value for some people, but I just have never gotten into it. My organization of like the actual references, like putting in the reference section, is probably very inefficient, where I actually end up kind of copying and pasting from other papers into my reference section, or maybe just typing it out. So it's very inefficient to do the reference section, but oddly satisfying to fill out the references. So yeah, I don't use EndNote, but some people have found it very useful. I don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, I see in the chat somebody said Zotero is good. I mean, of these, there are multiple different platforms. The two that I hear the most positive things about would be Zotero and Mendeley, but I've never personally used either of them. EndNote, I like I said, I tried it years ago, but it was taking me so much time to enter information in. I found it easier to just type the reference myself, maybe because I had APA format drilled into me early on. But these days you can download the citation from the library, the database search, and just copy and paste it. It's pretty quick. Some people like those platforms. I have never gotten into them personally.
So I'm looking at all the chats coming up. So is it safe? I don't want to put words in everyone's mouths, but is it safe to say that it's basically up to you to find the approach that works for you best? Is that because I'm sounding everyone has different preferences? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of being productive is knowing yourself and working out what works for you. There's a couple of people in the room who've taken my writing class, and that's one of the things we talk about a lot, right? It's like find a time, find a location, find a system that helps you to be productive, and it's not the same for everybody. I know a lot of people who work from sort of 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. That would never work for me, ever. But I can get up at 6 o'clock and write then, which a lot of people can't do. So you do need to know yourself, and you may have to try a few things out and decide what's good for you and what's not.
And I'm proud to say I am one of the individuals who has taken Dr. Anderman's writing class. So that is not the first time I've heard that. Wonderful. So switching gears a little bit, we danced around it a little bit about taking notes, and this is a question I wanted to bring up to the both of you. We have a course at Ohio State, and I'm sure across many universities, about learning to learn courses for undergraduate college students, and certainly the material applies to graduate students. And one of the topics is highlighting and taking notes, note-taking strategies. And so, do you have a system? And if so, if you could share some of your reading rituals, some of those elements, a ritual to taking notes or highlighting, what is effective for you in marking up the text to draw your eye to the important elements? Do you not do any of that? You just simply read it and take what you need from it and go away from it. So I'll start with Dr. Anderman, and we'll go to Dr. Fiorella. Please share your thoughts on that if you have any.
I do it a lot less now than I did originally. I think when I was a grad student, I used to highlight a lot. But now I think it goes back to more what we were talking about before, that you take notes specific to the purpose that you're using the article for. And it's not always going to be the same. Like I could cite the same article in 3 different things I'm writing and use it in a different way. So I guess I worry that highlighting or putting comments into the article itself would only sort of be specific to one use. If I'm using an article in my advanced seminar, right, I might want to draw attention to some very different points than the ones that I would zero in on if I'm writing an introduction to an empirical study, for example. So I think I do less of that, and I do the notes in a Word file, as we were just talking about.
Yeah, similar approach. I mean, I do highlight sometimes on the PDF itself, but it's really just as a way of like, when I come back to it, I see where I thought something was useful. It's not that I think that by highlighting it, I'm going to remember it any better. It just as a flag for later. Like if I go back, that's something that I thought was useful. And yeah, the actual valuable notes are all about getting out of the PDF itself and onto, into my own words, where I'm, usually for an empirical paper, I'm kind of thinking of it as, method, results, conclusion, and can I explain the method, what they did, what they found, and what it means in a pretty concise way. Because when you write about something in a manuscript of a study, you're not writing paragraph after paragraph about the same study. It's going to be pretty concise. I mean, you want to know what they did and some of the details, you want to know them so that you're representing it accurately. But when you actually write about it, you have to do it in a pretty concise way. So I'm always thinking about how I'm going to be communicating that, like how would I explain what was done in the study, and depending on the purpose, that I'm writing about for that particular writing project. But yeah, I don't find that much value. And I guess I'm the same, where I probably started out where I was like obsessively taking notes on everything. And then you just realize, like, for pragmatic purposes, like it's all going to come down to how you end up using this in your writing. And I just, that wasn't helping me for that. So I just focused on taking notes in Word.
Thank you both very much for that. So a theme I've been detecting both in Dr. Anderman and Dr. Fiorella's comments is about empirical work. So focusing on the method section and just organizing it that way. Now, let's talk for a second about conceptual or theory papers, right? One you might find in educational psychologists, right? There is no method section per se, and those papers tend to be much longer. Do you have particular strategies that are unique for these theory papers or conceptual papers that are more commentary based, they're longer? Is there no difference for you? I mean, does it all boil down to your purpose? So is there any commentary there on conceptual or theory based papers? And I'll start with Dr. Fiorella and then go to Dr. Anderman.
Yeah, it is different than an empirical paper because, like I was saying, yeah, with an empirical paper, I'm looking at the method, results, conclusion. So with a theory paper or conceptual paper, I guess where I'm kind of approaching it as, what is the contribution of this paper? Like, how does this advance how people had been thinking about this topic before, or how is it different than how I'd been thinking about it before reading it? And is this am I interpreting this as a useful new interpretation of the research area? And if so, what are the implications for my own research? What does this change about how I think of my own research? Does this give me any ideas for future research? So yeah, it's a different mindset in terms of just, these papers are about kind of giving an interpretation or an explanation of certain areas. And I'm kind of just looking for, how does this relate to how I was already thinking about this topic, or how others were? It depends on how familiar I am with the topic. And, is this a useful is this new? Is this actually new? Sometimes it's not. Is it actually useful? Sometimes it's not. So you just have to kind of evaluate it from there. It's like, what are the implications? Like, what does this do? What is this, what predictions are different from this new explanation? How does this change how you'd interpret other studies, things like that? So it's more of just like, what does this all mean? Like, what are the implications for understanding this area of research? And that could have, implications for how, planning new studies or interpreting your own results, coming up with new study ideas. So yeah, that's kind of my general approach for those types of articles.
Dr. Anderman?
Yeah, I actually really like reading conceptual pieces. Educational Psychologist is probably my favorite journal if I had to pick one. I'm much more likely to read those pieces sort of from start to finish. And if I think it's interesting and I think it's useful, I'll probably read it more than once, unless it's something I'm really familiar with. Because I think that's a great way to, this whole idea of sort of keeping up with the field. Depending on how you define field, there's no way to keep up with all of ed psych, right? You're not going to, but at least to keep some sort of finger in the water about different areas. I think articles like that can be really helpful. I actually was on the committee for several years that chose like the outstanding article in Educational Psychologist for the year. And so the way that worked was the editor would nominate half a dozen articles that he or she thought were potentially, the most outstanding. And the committee would have to read them all. And so I was reading in all sorts of fields that I know not very much about and trying to make a judgment about which one makes this sort of great contribution and it's well written and so forth. And I think if you have spare time, I do think reading those pieces once in a while outside of your real focus of research is very enlightening. But from how familiar you are with the field is going to really determine how you read it. Because if I'm reading something about, like literacy research, I have to really sort of dig in and focus very differently than if I'm reading an update to a theory that I'm with, then I can sort of say, well, do I buy this or not? I think that Logan's point about, is it really new? It's actually a really important one, because we're in an era where people, because of the reward structure in academia, people feel the need to constantly be introducing some new construct or new argument, and what you get is an old construct with a new name far too often. And so I think you have to read with a really analytic eye and ask yourself, is there, what's new about this? Is there something that expands our understanding, or are we just kind of rehashing old ideas? That's a bit of an aside, but it's definitely a different kind of reading from empirical studies, I think.
Thank you very much. I have a few more prompted questions. I do want to invite all of our audience members to drop questions in the chat. We are going to be moving into the audience participation portion here momentarily. If you have any questions for the panelists or general questions that we all can workshop together, feel free to drop them in the chat. We're happy to have those questions. Dr. Anderman, I'm going to go back to you. You mentioned that educational psychologist is your favorite, if you had to pick one. But I would ask you also, where would you say your go-to journals or outlets would be? Where would you draw the most material from? I know that's a broad question, so you can limit it in scope if you'd like to. But so where, if we were to ask you, where would we find Dr. Anderman looking for new material? Where would you say you tend to search for? Same to you, Dr. Fiorella, when we get to you. So Dr. Anderman, why don't you go ahead? What's your go-to journal or outlet or place to search for stuff?
I don't think I have one. I mean, I have some journals that publish more stuff that I like or am interested in than some others do. I kind of like the British Journal of Ed Psych, actually. I think they have some different stuff, and then Contemporary Ed Psych is very good, but it really depends on the topic. So, in the last, I don't know, a few years ago, Eric and I decided to launch this project on the school adjustment of internationally adopted youth. Right? There was nothing in Ed Psych journals that was relevant to that topic. We ended up spending a lot of time reading developmental journals, especially the adolescence journals. There was some stuff even in medical journals. And so it took me to places that I wouldn't normally read. And then I just, I was writing this thing about teacher-student relationships. An awful lot of that literature is in early childhood journals, and an awful lot of it is in school psychology journals. So again, not really what you would think of as central Ed Psych journals. So I don't have a go-to journal. I have journals that tend to publish the types of designs that I like or the questions that I'm interested in, but it's pretty broadly spread. I even read things in like the Journal of the Psychology of Men and Masculinities, right, for teacher-student relationships. You're going to find stuff in all kinds of places rather than targeting a particular journal. That said, I think it's instructive to pay attention when there's a change of editor in journals. It can really change the kinds of work they're looking for, the kinds of designs and methodology that they're willing to consider. So whenever there's a change of editor in a major journal, they usually write sort of an editorial philosophy as they take over, and it's well worth reading those because they do shift the focus of a journal, sometimes quite significantly when new editors take over. And I've known people who wasted months because they submitted something to a journal that violated something. The editor said, we will not publish this kind of work, and they didn't read it and they sent it in, and it got rejected and they had to send it somewhere else. So it's worth reading those editorial statements.
Fiorella, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I have a similar view. I think there are some journals that I pay a little bit more attention to just because, yeah, there's a higher concentration of papers that are relevant to my area, and those are the journals that I'd probably be more likely to publish in. Like, for me, it's like Journal of Ed Psych and Contemporary Ed Psych and Ed Psych Review and Learning and Instruction. Those are kind of and educational psychologists as well. So I would, there's some journals that I, would pay a little bit more attention to, I guess, just in terms of like when new articles come out. But as far as like, yeah, if I'm doing a literature review and I'm just, scrolling through articles, I don't really care, where the article's coming from, like what journal it's in. It's just gonna, a lot of the articles are probably gonna come from some of those journals I listed, but then, you'll get articles from completely different areas. And, so I would kind of just go wherever it takes me. And then when I mentioned I use Feedly to follow a bunch of journals, like I follow way more journals than I can actually keep up with. So just so that I can at least scroll through and see if there's, so I follow the main educational psychology journals, but I also follow a lot of journals in cognitive psychology and social psychology and science education and other areas, just in case, I happen to stumble upon something that is relevant. It might be at a smaller percentage, but that's just a way of kind of making sure that I'm not too narrow in what I'm considering. So yeah, there's definitely kind of a balance of, we all have limited bandwidth, so we can't pay attention to everything, obviously. So there's going to be some places that you focus your attention more than others, but still giving yourself an opportunity to broaden when you're, doing a literature review or you're trying to keep up with kind of what's going on.
Fantastic. And we're transitioning into the audience participation portion, and Elise Allen just asked an excellent question. They're very related to this. Also, Elise is one of the other lucky few of us that got to take Dr. Anderman's writing class, so she knows all about this. But she asked, do you have any tips for reading across literatures from different fields and or regions? So she's thinking in particular terms of connecting different but similar concepts and or preparing literature reviews for an intro section. So we're hearing a lot about this cross literature situation across different journals with different focus, with different priorities. How do you go about navigating that? Dr. Anderman and then Dr. Fiorella.
This is kind of funny coming from Elise, because we were just talking about it the other day. But I guess I've done a fair amount of this over the years. So if I'm interpreting the question correctly, it's like similar constructs, but not exactly the same in different literatures, and how do you sort of handle that? I think it's different writing a substantive literature review, such as you would do in a dissertation, or if you were writing a book chapter or something like that, or a review article, than it is if you're doing the introduction to an empirical study, because obviously there's big differences in sort of length. And I think if it's an introduction to an empirical study, you kind of have to pick a framework and go with it. That doesn't mean that you might not cite work that's done in a different field, maybe under a different name, but you kind of have to. So I'll use goal theory as an example, because that's an easy one for me to just do off the top of my head, right? So what we now call mastery goals, once upon a time, people called them learning goals, right? You can say, I'm going to use the term mastery goal, you use it consistently, but if you're citing something old that used the term learning goal, you can just put something in parentheses that says, also known as, and move on. Pick one and kind of stick with it as much as possible. When the fine distinctions and definitions are so minuscule that they don't really matter, and that's not the point you're trying to make, you don't want to get bogged down in distinguishing between the two. But if you're writing something really much more substantial, then I think you have to kind of lay out your argument for why these two things are really the same, even though they're talked about differently. So, you know, as motivation people, we tend to use the term school belonging. There's an awful lot of research in school psychology that talks about school connectedness. So you've really got to get back to the conceptual definitions of those things and make your case, if that's the case you're trying to make, that they're really conceptually the same, even though the definitions and the language are different. And I think it's, that's difficult work to do, right? You really have to sort of have a good conceptual overview of both of the literatures that you're trying to pull together. And that's some of the most challenging intellectual work, is to make those kinds of connections maybe haven't been done for you before. I want to go back to a question somebody asked earlier, because I think it's related, which was, as graduate students, at what point did you feel like you really knew a topic? Which I think is a great question. And I actually had this conversation with my husband earlier today, because I was trying to remember, somebody said to me back many years ago, you will never know your literature as well as you do the day you defend your dissertation. Like, it's all downhill after that. But I think that when you do a dissertation, you know a very narrow topic in extreme depth and detail, right? So that's one way of knowing a topic. You should know, and people do, know that literature specifically related to their study extremely well. But my experience, at least, has been that you can't keep that up at that level, because what happens is you get broader, but you can't also have that level of depth. And like I said, I've been publishing the last few years on adopted kids and on teacher-student relationships, and I did this thing on IAP with Alyssa, and there's no way to have that deep level of expertise in all of those. So, you know, you have to work out how much is enough to know.
Fantastic. Dr. Fiorella, anything to add?
Not really. I think I agree with all of that. Yeah, I think, well, I guess both questions, the last question about, you know, when you really know a topic, yeah, I think that's exactly right. You have your main topic, which you probably know really, really well, and you know, you have a lot of depth, but it's pretty narrow, because you can't have that kind of depth and also, you know, at this, you know, the same depth, you know, broader. So you have to understand that there's going to be different levels of knowing the literature. Some things you're just going to be like, you're just going to know it exists, and then others you're going to know, you know, at another level of depth, and then yeah, you're going to have your main research area. So I don't know if you ever really, there's ever a moment where you feel like you know it. I guess, yeah, when you do your dissertation, for me, it was when I did my comps, like I was reading all these articles. I was like, oh, this is great. I was forced to read, like, you know, hundreds of articles. And then, yeah, it kind of does feel downhill from there. But at some point, I guess you get to where you have a pretty good foundation. And then it's about kind of keeping up with the, you know, kind of updating as new stuff comes in. But even that, yeah, is obviously very challenging because there's so much. But at least within your own little world, you can, it's not too difficult to keep up. So yeah, you just have to balance the depth and the breadth.
Absolutely. Preeti asked, do you follow a particular order of reading sections while reading a research article? And I know we talked before about, you know, popping in to read the methods, or just having, depending on your purpose. But if you have an article in front of you, is there sort of, do you have a method to method to the method? That was not an intentional word choice. But anyway, do you have a process for reading through through an article? I'll start with Dr. Fiorella.
Yeah, I mean, if it's again, like anything else, it depends on the exact purpose. But if it's basically in my area of research, I will focus mostly on the method. The introduction, I can probably predict basically what's going to be in there, and then once I know the result of the study, I can kind of predict how it's going to be talked about in the discussion a little bit. So I would focus mostly on the method. And if I'm just reading a new paper that's in my area, but if I'm trying to become more familiar with an area that I'm not familiar with, then I might look for existing reviews or look more at the introductions of these empirical papers and the discussion to hear about how they talk about these areas, because for those topics I don't have a way of talking about those areas as well. So I'm more reliant on the introduction and discussion of those types of in topics that are outside my area. But if it is in my area, then yeah, the method and results would be like the place that I would start. And then if I need to, I can kind of see what they're talking about in the discussion, something like that. But yeah, it's totally, again, dependent on level of familiarity with the topic and what your actual goal is in terms of translating this into your own writing. So yeah, that's the general approach.
You agree, Dr. Anderman?
Yeah, I do. I didn't I already answer this question?
I think you might have. Yes.
If it's something I don't know much at all about, then I will start at the beginning, right? Start with the abstract and see if it's even something that I'm interested in. But yeah, I don't know that I've ever thought about it as having a particular strategy. I just kind of go in looking for what I need out of it.
Right. Well, then let me ask you, since I have taken your writing class and I admire you so much and your ability to write, we have a question from W. Mark Jackman about writing. Sometimes he finds that articles take months to write, others take years to write. So is it normal to have different articles take different amounts of time to produce?
Absolutely, it's normal. Years would worry me a little bit, but it depends what kind of article you're talking about, I guess. I do a lot of collaborative writing, which I really like, and I think actually some of the best products come out of those, but that can slow it down because other people have multiple demands on their time and you're waiting for somebody to do their part, and so that can make it slower. I think if you're trying to write a conceptual article, that can take a really long time. I saw DeLeon Gray was logged in for half a second, but he looks like he's gone again. He has a great story to tell about his piece that ended up being an award-winning article in Ed Psychologist, but that was like his third attempt at that article, right? He worked on that for years trying to get it published before it finally won an award. So I think that some empirical pieces can come together pretty quickly. So yeah, I think it's normal. But if you've been slaving over something for years, I really hope it's worth it. Otherwise, maybe you have to ask yourself, why is it still taking so long? And sometimes, honestly, it's that we're all so perfectionist and we have so much imposter syndrome that we just don't let things go. And I think sometimes just being willing to say, this is good enough, I'm going to send it out and see what the reviewers say. That can be really difficult to do, but sometimes you're holding on to things when you should just put them out there and see. Absolutely,
and also
rejection. But if it gets rejected, you just tweak it and send it somewhere else.
Dr. Fiorella, anything to add on that question?
Yeah, so yeah, the same kind of response there. I think it definitely depends. I mean, some things take a lot longer than others to write. I think for empirical papers, that are kind of, if you have like once you kind of build a bit of a coherent program of research and you've written about the same kinds of topics, several times, it gets a lot easier. I think it goes a little bit faster. Some people don't have, are jumping and doing different, a lot of different areas. And so it's a little more challenging. But if you have, you're writing about something that you've written about before, it makes it much easier to find that structure, and it can go a lot faster. But yeah, it depends, because if you're writing a, more conceptual article, that can take a lot longer. But yeah, I think for empirical papers, those can be, generally done pretty efficiently if you get some practice in doing it.
Absolutely. Thank you both very much. And thank you all for the audience questions. If you have any more questions for the panelists, please, this will be a final last call to turn in a question in the chat. But we do have one additional question for the two panelists regarding just some overall takeaways, some recommendations. If I were to ask you, how do I stay current on my educational research, whatever my particular area of interest may be, so that obviously is variable. What's your best practice? What would be your recommendation for staying current? I'll start with Dr. Fiorella, and then we'll go to Dr. Anderman. If I just said, how would I stay current? What would you say would be the best practice for me to try?
Okay, so I guess keeping with the theme of not having a strong separation between reading and writing, I would say it starts with, having a very solid writing habit, consistently writing, working on your most important writing project each day if you can, and building into that, that at least the way I would do it is that at the early stages, that would be reading time. But so establishing that, having time set aside for writing without distractions that you can rely on each day is, really helpful. And then it's not so much a matter of like, how much time do you spend reading and writing? It's just, if you do it a little bit each day, you'll be fine. Like if you write a little bit each day, you're going to be fine. If you read a little bit each day, you're going to be fine. So, so consistency, I think, is probably the key. And, for me, it's connecting reading to, either specific projects or some kind of deadline. So we didn't really talk too much about like reviewing manuscripts, but we both review manuscripts as well. And that's a way of keeping up with the literature, and it's tied to a deadline. So I have no choice. I need to read this paper. And if I'm preparing for a class that I'm teaching, a seminar, and I have readings, I have to read for those. That's tying it again to like a deadline or a specific task. Or if I'm, I do like a journal club with my lab where we read and discuss papers. That's another way of just incorporating it more into your life, where it's tied to something specific, rather than just saying, well, I really should read more, right? It's just, so I think a consistent habit of devoting time to writing and incorporating reading with that, that's, consistency, I think, is pretty important.
Dr. Anderman?
Yeah, well, I agree with all of that. I think once you're in an academic position, in a faculty position, finding those ways that your responsibilities can overlap, like reading for a class. If you're lucky enough to be able to teach an advanced doctoral seminar in your area, which I have been lucky enough to do, I always stick in a few articles that I've been meaning to read into the reading list, and sometimes they're disappointing, and I'm like, oh, that wasn't good as I thought it was going to be. But it's a way of getting your teaching, advising, and reading to connect. I think is really helpful. I agree with the consistency on writing. I was going to say reviewing. Reviewing is actually a really good way of staying on top of new ideas that are sort of popping in your field. Sometimes I come across something and I'm like, I have no idea what this is. And so I have to actually go away and look for something in the reference list and read up on it, right? Because somebody's introduced some new construct that I wasn't familiar with. I mean, the other thing I would say, and this has been really hard in the last year and a half, but conferences I think are critically important. And because there you get work that's often nascent, that people are just trying things out. It's a long way from publication maybe, but they're working through some ideas or they're thinking about something. I really like going to poster sessions. You can go and hear Mr. Famous Professor give a keynote, and you hear one person talk about one field, one sort of line of work for an hour, or you can walk around a poster session and see 15 studies and maybe have 4 or 5 good in-depth conversations with people about their thinking and where they're trying to go with it and what they're using. And so I really encourage people to, when we can all do this in person again, go to poster sessions and sort of walk down the middle of the aisle and scan things. And then when you see one that's interesting, you sort of zoom in and have a conversation and then move on. I find that one of the best ways to sort of feel like I'm keeping up with what all my colleagues are thinking about.
And so some related to that, we have another question come into the chat. I think it's really great. I want to bring it up before we transition to the collaborative exercise we have planned. Is this? There's a certain point based on the question where you're drawing upon a reliable set or a cache of sources. At what point do you sort of get an inclination that I need to update my literature? I need to update my reliable set, my cache. When would I start doing that? So do you have any insights on that, Dr. Anderman, and then Dr. Fiorella?
Well, sometimes reviewers will tell you, like, I was really surprised that you didn't cite this. And you're like, oh, somehow I missed that. And then you go away and find it and read it and you put it in if you think it's relevant. I mean, I don't think, if you're publishing a series of studies sort of on the same topic or in a line, you are going to have your reliable cache, but I don't think you should ever sort of just sit on it. And I think that's where some of the things Logan was talking about early on about getting these RSS feeds, or you can set up all kinds of different alerts. If there's a particular study that is really critical to you, you can get alerts every time somebody cites it, right? It can get overwhelming, but if you're selective and you don't do too many of those, I think you always want to be on the lookout for new things to add to the cache rather than, oh, I haven't updated this in 5 years, I should probably go find some new stuff.
Anything to add, Dr. Fiorella?
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what I try to do is, yeah, you have a set of papers that you're referencing a lot, but then if you do use like alerts, like I use Feedly, and I say, you know, I kind of tag things like I know, okay, this is going to be useful later. Then I do try to kind of each time I write about the same topic, I'm going back to look for, has there been new research that might be relevant for this, and I might incorporate a couple of new citations just to, yeah, I mean, part of it is pragmatic, just to show that you're aware of it, and so that you don't get reviewers saying you're not, you know, up to date. But yeah, part of it is just to keep kind of evolving the way you're discussing these ideas and incorporating the newest research. So, you know, over time, you might have written the same style of introduction on the same sort of topics, but it's going to kind of slowly change each time you write it based off of new research. At least that's the idea. But if you kind of have a basic system of tagging new relevant articles, then it can be, you know, sprinkling a couple of those in there shouldn't be too difficult.
Well, thank you both so much for your comments. I would like to, because we switched to a different Zoom link here, and I believe we lost the links from before. I've just dropped into the chat the links to Dr. Anderman's co-authored textbooks. You can feel free to check those out. Dr. Anderman is a co-author on classroom motivation, linking research to teacher practice, as well as educational psychology, developing learners. So I wanted to make sure we got that into the chat and promoted those books, Dr. Anderman. So we do
Thank you
have
so much.
You're welcome. Absolutely. We do have a collaborative exercise plan for everybody. This is a low pressure, low stakes, optional exercise if you'd like to engage in it.